The grease under my fingernails felt like permanent ink. I stared at the legal pad in the diner booth. Dad leaned back and grinned. He made a promise that felt like a blood oath. He said, I would run it all one day. Dad retired and gave our business. I worked 12 years to build with him to my brother. Because he deserves it, as the golden child. Then he demoted me. So I left and took half the business with me to rebuild. But that betrayal came later. 12 years passed in a blur of copper pipes and frozen mechanical rooms. I became the ghost in the machine of our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning empire. While Justin chased sunsets in California, I hauled compressors up iron stairs. My social life died in a nursing home basement on Christmas Eve. I traded my 20s for the hum of industrial condensers. Dad watched me sweat and nodded with pride. He called me his rock. I didn't notice the rock was actually a foundation for someone else to stand on. Justin returned with a tan and a suitcase full of buzzwords. He didn't know a wrench from a regulator. Dad tucked him into an office chair like a fragile doll. Every dinner became a lecture on Justin's social media ideas. I landed a $500,000 contract and Dad asked if Justin had approved the font on the bid. The crew started looking at me with pity. Justin sat in meetings and talked about synergy while I calculated load. The air in the office grew thin. The staff meeting felt like a funeral for my future. Dad stood at the head of the oak table. He announced his retirement with a watery smile. Then he dropped the hammer. Justin was the new CEO. The room went cold. I felt the blood drain from my face. Phil the foreman looked at the floor. Dad didn't meet my eyes once. He kept talking about Justin's vision. My 12 years of loyalty were suddenly worth less than my brother's 3 years of posting photos. I followed Dad into his office. He wouldn't look up from a photo frame. I demanded an explanation for the stolen legacy. He sighed and said Justin needed the win more. He told me I was strong enough to start over. Then came the final insult. He offered me a senior technician role. I was to crawl through attics while my brother signed the checks. I realized then that my father loved my brother's weakness more than my strength. He had already replaced me. The cold anger settled in my chest at midnight. I called Phil and 3 lead techs. They were done with the golden child's games. By dawn, I had 5 major clients ready to jump ship. I walked into the shop one last time. I didn't pack a box. I just handed Dad my resignation and a copy of my new business license. He turned a deep shade of purple. I didn't wait for him to speak. I had already taken the heart of his company with me. The office door slammed behind me with a finality that echoed through the loading bay. I stood in the humid morning air and inhaled the scent of diesel and copper. 12 years of loyalty were gone in a single heartbeat. My objective was clear. I had to move before Dad could freeze me out. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed Phil. He answered on the second ring. I told him the diner was the new headquarters. He didn't ask why. Phil arrived at the booth with 2 senior technicians in tow. They looked like men who had seen a ghost. I spread my notebook across the sticky table. My primary obstacle was time and capital. Dad had the trucks and the warehouse. I had the knowledge and the relationships. I laid out the math of the new LLC. The men watched me with hard eyes. They were tired of Justin's buzzwords. They wanted a leader who could actually read a blueprint. I explained that the risk was total. We would be starting with used vans and personal tools. Carlos leaned forward and showed me his call logs. 3 major clients had already messaged him asking if the CEO rumor was true. This was the mid-scene turn. The clients weren't loyal to the company name. They were loyal to the hands that fixed their machines. I realized then that Dad didn't own the business. We did. The power shifted in that moment. We spent the afternoon filing paperwork on a laptop. Every signature felt like a declaration of war. I drained my personal savings to cover the initial bonding and insurance. The cost was a heavy punch to my gut. But every dollar spent was a link broken from my father's chain. We found a small rental space in the industrial district by sunset. It was a concrete shell with a leaky roof. It was perfect because it was ours. By the second day, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Justin had tried to manage a refrigerant leak at the hospital and failed. The facility manager called my personal cell and screamed for help. I told him I was no longer with the family firm. He didn't care about the drama. He just wanted the chiller back online before the surgery suites overheated. I took the job on my own terms. My new company had its first official work order. We arrived at the hospital in a beat-up white van. The staff looked confused to see us without the family logo. I didn't waste time on explanations. We went straight to the mechanical room. The compressor was rattling like a cage of angry birds. Justin had bypassed a safety sensor and almost fried the motor. I fixed the error in 20 minutes. The manager shook my hand and handed me a check. He told me never to send Justin again. I drove back to the small shop feeling like a king. The sun was dipping low over the skyline. My phone buzzed with a message from my mother. She said Dad was in the hospital with chest pains. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I looked at the check in my hand, and then at the road ahead. This was the micro twist I hadn't planned for. The war had barely started, but the first casualty was already my father's heart. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The hospital check sat on the dashboard like a taunt. I had to reach the emergency room to see if my father was dying. The primary obstacle was my own paralyzing guilt. If I had stayed silent, his heart might be steady. I parked the van crookedly and ran through the sliding glass doors. The smell of antiseptic stung my nose. My mother sat alone in the corner. Mom looked up with red eyes and a trembling chin. She didn't offer a hug. She told me the doctors were running tests on his arteries. Justin was already inside the room with a lawyer. That was the mid-scene turn that froze my blood. This wasn't just a medical crisis. It was a strategic play for the remaining assets. Dad was vulnerable, and the golden child was circling the cage. I felt the last shred of family loyalty vanish. I pushed past the nurse and entered the private suite. Dad looked small under the fluorescent lights. His skin was the color of wet ash. Justin stood by the bed holding a thick stack of legal papers. The lawyer looked uncomfortable and stared at the floor. My objective was simple: stop the signing. I grabbed the pen from Justin's hand before it touched the page. The silence in the room was heavy and sharp. We stood there. "Get out," Justin hissed with a venom I hadn't heard before. He claimed I was the one who caused the stroke. I looked at the papers on the blanket. It was a full transfer of the commercial real estate. Dad tried to speak, but only a dry rasp came out. He looked at me with a mixture of shame and fear. I realized Justin was terrified of the competition I had built. He needed the land to survive. The lawyer stepped forward to intervene. I told him the document was invalid if Dad was under duress. Justin's face turned a mottled red. He realized I knew the game he was playing. I wasn't just a technician anymore. I was a business owner who understood the law. The power in the room shifted toward the foot of the bed. Dad's monitor started to beep a frantic rhythm. The nurse rushed in and pushed us back. We waited in the hallway like two hungry wolves. Justin paced the linoleum floor while I leaned against the wall. He kept checking his phone for service updates. The hospital chiller I had fixed was the only thing keeping this floor cool. He didn't even know I was the one who had saved his biggest contract today. The irony felt like a lead weight in my pocket. I watched him crumble under the weight of his own incompetence. The doctor finally emerged with a grim expression. He said Dad was stable, but would need months of recovery. He would never return to the office again. Justin looked relieved at the news of the retirement. But then, the doctor handed me a sealed envelope. Dad had written my name on it in shaky script. I opened it and found a single key to the old warehouse. Justin didn't have a copy. I held the only spare. I palmed the cold brass key as I walked through the hospital parking lot. The weight of it felt like a heavy secret. My objective was to secure the critical blueprints stored in the cradled warehouse before Justin could change the locks. The primary obstacle was the rising storm of local rumors about Dad's health. If the suppliers heard the business was failing, they would cut our credit lines tonight. I had to move faster than the gossip. The warehouse was a cavern of rusted steel and old memories. I pulled the heavy door open and inhaled the scent of ozone and motor oil. The mid-scene turn arrived when I saw 3 of Dad's trucks parked in the back. They weren't empty. Justin had been liquidating the inventory to pay for his failed branding campaigns. Thousands of dollars in copper piping and high-end compressors were missing. He was gutting the family legacy for quick cash. I reached the office in the back and found the filing cabinet. My hands shook as I flipped through the job folders. These were the schematics for every major building in 3 counties. I heard the crunch of gravel outside and froze. A set of headlights swept across the dusty windows. I ducked behind a stack of air filters and waited. The engine killed, and the silence of the industrial park felt thick and suffocating. Justin stepped through the door with 2 men I didn't recognize. They looked like hired muscle or desperate liquidators. My brother was frantic and kept pointing at the empty shelves. He didn't see me in the shadows. He told the men they could take the remaining inventory if they paid him in cash right now. He was selling off pieces of the company inventory to cover his personal debts. The betrayal felt like a fresh wound in the dark. I stood up and switched on the overhead lights. The sudden glare made Justin jump and shield his eyes. I told the men to leave before I called the police for trespassing. They looked at Justin, then at my steady hands, and decided the cash wasn't worth a felony. They backed out of the warehouse without a word. Justin was left standing alone in the center of the bay. He looked smaller than I had ever seen. "You ruined everything," he screamed, his voice cracking against the corrugated walls. He claimed I was the one who drove Dad to the hospital. I didn't argue with a desperate man. I just held up the warehouse key Dad had given me. Justin's eyes widened as he realized the true hierarchy of trust. He had the title, but I had the physical heart of the operation. He realized then that he was the one locked out of the family. I grabbed the blueprints and walked past him toward my van. The night air was cool, but the tension was still rising. I looked at the key in my hand and realized it wasn't just for a door. It was for a safe I didn't know existed. I noticed a small tag on the ring I hadn't seen before. It listed a bank box number and a date from 20 years ago. Dad had a secret account. I sat in the van and stared at the handwritten tag. The bank box number was a lifeline I hadn't expected. My objective was to reach the vault before the bank opened for the weekend. The primary obstacle was my own fatigue and a sudden police siren 2 blocks away. I didn't want a confrontation in the middle of the night. I drove slowly toward the city center and parked in an alleyway. The city felt cold. The morning sun hit the marble bank columns with a harsh glare. I walked inside and presented the key to a woman in a gray suit. She led me into the quiet basement. The mid-scene turn happened when she pulled the long metal box from the wall. It wasn't full of cash or gold. It was packed with signed contracts and original partnership deeds from the 90s. Dad hadn't built this alone. My mother's name was on every page. I realized then that Justin had no legal right to the land. My mother owned 50% of the company assets. The power balance shifted as I read the fine print of the original incorporation. Dad had buried these documents to protect his pride. He wanted the world to think he was a self-made man. I felt a surge of adrenaline as I realized I had the legal leverage to stop the liquidation. I was finally ahead. I called my mother from the lobby. Her voice sounded tired and distant on the phone. I told her what I had found in the vault. There was a long silence on her end of the line. She admitted she had stayed silent to keep the family together. She didn't want Dad to feel small in front of his sons. But Justin was currently destroying her retirement fund for his ego. She finally agreed to meet me at the office. We arrived at the family headquarters and found Justin changing the door locks. He looked startled to see Mom standing next to me. He tried to hug her, but she stepped back with a cold stare. I held up the partnership deed like a weapon. I told him he had 4 hours to return the stolen inventory or face a lawsuit. He claimed the business was his to run. He didn't understand that he was trespassing on Mom's property. Justin's bravado crumbled into a frantic plea for mercy. He confessed he had borrowed money from dangerous people to fund his lifestyle. The branding campaigns were a cover for his massive gambling debts. This was the dark reality of the golden child's failure. He wasn't just incompetent. He was a liability to our physical safety. Mom's face went pale as she realized the depth of his lies. The family unit was shattered beyond any repair. I watched Justin pack his bags in the executive office. He looked like a stranger in an expensive suit. Mom sat in the lobby and stared at the logo on the wall. We had the legal power, but the bank account was nearly empty. Then my phone buzzed with an alert from our new shop. Phil said, a massive storm was moving in from the north. Every commercial heating and cooling system in the county was about to fail. The sky turned a bruised shade of violet as the first gusts of wind rattled the office windows. My objective was to pivot our skeleton crew to handle the incoming emergency calls before the storm paralyzed the city. The primary obstacle was our lack of functioning service vehicles. Justin had left the family fleet in shambles, and my startup only had 2 reliable vans. I checked the radar on my tablet. The temperature was dropping fast. Ice would soon coat every commercial rooftop in 3 counties. I looked at Mom as she stood in the center of the dusty warehouse. She pulled a set of keys from her coat pocket. She had quietly maintained a separate lease for the backup fleet under her own name for years. This was the mid-scene turn. She told me she had a private storage unit filled with refurbished parts and 3 older trucks Dad thought were scrapped. She had been quietly preparing for a disaster for years. The power shifted as I realized we finally had the hardware to compete. We had a chance to save the city. We raced to the storage unit through the freezing rain. The trucks were old, but the engines roared to life with a satisfying growl. Phil and the technicians arrived within minutes to load the gear. I felt the adrenaline of the hunt. We weren't just fixing machines tonight. We were reclaiming our reputation from the wreckage of Justin's greed. Every manifold gauge and vacuum pump felt like a weapon in my hands. The mission was clear. We had to keep the hospitals online. The first call came from the regional shopping center. Their main boiler had flatlined, and the pipes were at risk of bursting. I led the convoy through the slushy streets. The wind was screaming now. We climbed the iron ladder to the roof, while the building groaned under the pressure. The ice was thick on the intake vents. I used a torch to clear the frost, while Phil checked the internal sensors. We worked in a tight rhythm born of a decade. By midnight, we had restored heat to 4 major buildings. My hands were numb, and my face was raw from the sleet. Then a frantic message flashed on my screen from the nursing home. This was the same facility where I spent my lonely Christmas years ago. Their backup generator had failed, and the residents were shivering in the dark. I knew the layout of that mechanical room by heart. It was a labyrinth of old steam pipes and failing electrical panels. We arrived to find the hallways filled with shadows and the smell of fear. The manager grabbed my arm and begged for a miracle. I went straight to the basement and found the generator drowned in a pool of oily water. The primary obstacle was a cracked fuel line that Justin's team had ignored during their last inspection. I had to bypass the main valve without causing an explosion. The pressure was immense. One wrong spark would end the night in a tragedy. I found a scrap of copper tubing in my toolkit and began the repair. The mid-scene turn happened when I saw the inspection tag on the unit. It wasn't signed by a technician. It was signed by Justin himself. He had lied about the maintenance to pocket the service fee. My brother's signature was a death warrant for these people. I felt a cold fury that pushed my hands to move faster. I flared the pipe and tightened the fitting. The generator coughed, and then hummed into a steady vibration. Lights flickered to life throughout the facility. The cheers from the floors above echoed down the stairwell. I leaned against the cold concrete wall and breathed. We had done it. We had fixed what the golden child had broken. But as I walked out to the van, I saw a familiar car idling in the snow. It was the lawyer who had been in Dad's hospital room. The lawyer stepped out of the black sedan with a look of pure panic. He didn't have his legal pads this time. He told me that Justin had reportedly fled the state with the company's remaining cash reserves. But that wasn't the worst part. My brother had used the family home as collateral for a private loan. The house was being seized by a predatory lender in the morning. My mother's residence was gone. The betrayal had a final, crushing weight. I looked at the nursing home and then at the dark road ahead. The storm was still raging, but the internal weather was much worse. I had saved the business and the clients, but the family foundation was a crater. I told the lawyer to meet me at the shop. I had one card left to play, but it required a sacrifice I wasn't sure I could make. I had to sell my startup to buy back my mother's peace. I drove through the whiteout conditions toward the city's financial district. My objective was to intercept the predatory lender before the foreclosure papers were finalized at dawn. The primary obstacle was the sheer scale of Justin's debt. He had signed a variable rate bridge loan with a shark masquerading as a private equity firm. I gripped the wheel as the van slid on a patch of black ice. My startup's entire valuation was the only collateral I had left to offer. The stakes were absolute. The office of the lender was a glass tower that seemed to touch the storm clouds. I walked into the lobby drenched and smelling of burnt copper. The mid-scene turn happened when I saw the lender's portfolio on the desk. They weren't just after the house. They were specifically targeting my new company, Summit Commercial Services. Justin had used my 12-year reputation as a guarantee for his personal loans, without my knowledge. He had forged my signature on a secondary lien. I felt a cold chill. I sat across from a man named Miller, who wore a tailored suit and a predatory smile. He told me the forgery was technically a felony, but he preferred the assets over a police report. My primary obstacle was now a legal trap. If I fought the forgery, Justin went to prison and the family home was lost anyway. If I signed, I became a subsidiary of his firm. Miller watched me like a hawk. He knew I was the only one who could work. I pulled the partnership deed from my jacket pocket. I showed him that the family home was actually owned by my mother's separate trust. Dad had transferred it decades ago, during a previous business slump. Justin had no legal authority to pledge the property as collateral. The power balance shifted instantly. Miller's smile vanished as he realized his ironclad contract was built on sand. He looked at his lawyer and saw a sudden flicker of doubt. The game had changed for us. We negotiated for 3 hours while the wind howled against the reinforced glass. I offered a settlement that favored his firm, but protected my mother's roof. I would handle the hospital's massive retrofit project and funnel the profits directly to the debt. It was a high-speed treadmill of labor with no personal gain. I was essentially buying back my mother's peace with my own sweat. Miller agreed to the terms. I signed the new papers with a heavy hand. I was now a servant. I left the tower and found Phil waiting in the van. He saw the look on my face and knew the cost was high. I told him we had to work twice as hard for half the pay. He just nodded and handed me a thermos of hot coffee. The men were still with me despite the grim news. We headed back to the nursing home to finish the cleanup. The storm was finally breaking. A weak gray light began to touch the horizon. The morning sun cut through the clouds, bringing a strange, hollow victory. I drove to my mother's house and saw her sitting on the porch swing. She looked older in the dawn light. I told her the house was safe and the debt was managed. She didn't ask how I did it. She just held my hand and cried. I realized that the golden child had taken her pride, but I had saved her dignity. It was a trade I would make every single time. We spent the next week working 18-hour shifts. Every joint in my body ached from the repetitive motion of the wrench. My objective was to clear the first debt milestone before the interest compounded. The obstacle was the sheer volume of repairs needed across the county. Justin's neglected systems were failing one by one. It was like fighting a fire with a squirt bottle. But the reputation of Summit was growing. People saw us out in the cold. We were the experts. I finally returned to the hospital to check on Dad. He was sitting up in bed and watching the news. He saw the segment about our heroic work during the storm. He looked at me and tried to apologize for the demotion. I stopped him before the words could form. I told him the business was gone, but the family was still standing. He reached out and touched the calluses on my palms. He finally saw the cost of his favoritism. He looked truly broken. As I walked out of the ward, I saw a familiar figure by the vending machines. It was Justin, looking disheveled and frantic. He hadn't fled the state after all. He was looking for one last handout before the law caught up to him. He saw me and his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. But then, 2 plainclothes officers stepped out from behind the pillar. They had a warrant for the forgery. My brother looked at me and screamed for help. The metal handcuffs clicked over Justin's wrists with a sharp, final sound. I watched the officers lead him away through the hospital lobby. My objective was finally reached. The threat to our mother's home was neutralized. However, the primary obstacle remained the massive debt I now carried on my back. Miller still held the lion over my company. I walked past the vending machines and felt the weight of my exhaustion. The family legacy was a pile of ash. I returned to the ward to find Dad staring at the television. He had seen the arrest on the local news ticker. He didn't ask me to save Justin this time. The mid-scene turn came when he handed me a heavy, weathered leather ledger. It was a secret record of every penny he had siphoned from the business. He had been paying off Justin's debts for years. He admitted that the business was never actually solvent. I was building on sand. The realization hit me harder than any physical blow. Every contract I won was just filling a bottomless hole created by Dad's guilt. I looked at the calloused skin of my palms and felt a strange sense of relief. The lie was dead. I didn't owe him my life or my future. I was finally free to be just a technician or a king. I stood up and closed the ledger. Dad watched me with a hollow, broken expression. I met Phil at the warehouse to discuss the path forward. We decided to liquidate the remaining family assets to settle the lie-in with Miller. It was the only way to save Summit from the predatory reach of the bank. We worked through the night, tagging every old truck and spare compressor for auction. The primary obstacle was my own sentimentality. I had to sell the tools that taught me the trade. Every wrench had a story. By dawn, the warehouse was nearly empty and the debt was cleared. My mother arrived with a thermos of coffee and a steady smile. She told me she was selling the house anyway, to move into a smaller apartment. She wanted to give me the proceeds to truly start Summit without any strings. This was the truth I had finally earned. I didn't need a legacy. I just needed my own name. The air felt clear. We opened the doors of the new shop on Monday morning. The sign above the door was simple and bold. I saw a black sedan pull into the gravel lot. A man stepped out, but it wasn't Miller or the police. It was the hospital manager I had helped during the storm. He wasn't there for a repair. He offered me a multi-year maintenance contract for the entire city hospital network. The golden child was gone. I was finally the owner.